Good morning, J Street. It's great to see everybody again. Did everybody have a good time last night? Get a little bit worked up, ready to go? I think you probably got the message that the theme of our conference this year is living our values and defending democracy. So this morning, we're going to do a deeper dive into the threats that democracy faces, both here in the United States and in Israel. We're going to talk about how J Street and our allies are confronting extremism and bigotry, and we're going to talk a bit about our vision for a liberal democratic future, small d, because we are nonpartisan, small d democratic future rooted in peace and justice and equality. Over the past year, J Street's work has been very focused on defending American democracy at the ballot box. We did everything that we could to elect and support our pro-Israel, pro-peace, and pro-democracy candidates in the 2022 midterms, and to keep election deniers, conspiracy theorists, and white nationalists from taking control of Congress. On election night, we were relieved, to say the least. I'm sure many of you shared that sense as well, and we were energized that some of our worst fears were averted. And we saw so many of our candidates win in critical races. I don't know if all of you know, but 90% of J Street PAC endorsed candidates won. And that includes some really key Senate races: Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and I think there's one more still to go. Is that right? Tuesday, Raphael Warnock in Georgia. So democracy, let's hear it for Raphael Warnock. All right. Woo! And I think we're all relieved that democracy has proven a little bit more resilient in our country than some of its opponents had hoped. But we know that the threats, both in 2024 and beyond, are real. So tonight, in the first half of our plenary, I tell you, the script says tonight, and I said to myself when I read the script, I need to change that so it doesn't. In today's plenary, two panels will look at the lessons from the 2022 elections. On the first panel, we're having some great friends of J Street: the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wickler, and the president of a really important organization that's a partner of J Street, End Citizens United. And I think you all know how important that statement is, ending Citizens United, Tiffany Muller. And they're going to speak with our new political director, who has just come back to J Street, Tali DeGroot, about how we, about how we are going to combat voter suppression, gerrymandering, and other threats to democracy. They're going to talk also about some of the messaging strategies, what works to get that across to folks. And then in the second panel, we'll be hearing from a really dear friend of mine, veteran social justice leader Ruth Messenger, and the co-director of Indivisible, Leah Grainberg, and they're going to be speaking with Logan Bayroff about the role that was played in the 2022 elections, the really unfortunate and destructive role that was played in the 2022 elections by some pro-Israel groups, and discuss how we and our partners work together to counter the harmful endorsements and interventions of those groups. So we'll turn to those exciting discussions in a moment, but first, I'm pleased to share with you a couple of messages from some new friends and some old friends who are among the 122 victorious J Street candidates in 2022.
Hi, everybody. I'm U.S. Senator Maggie Hassan. First of all, I just want to start by thanking J Street for everything you did for my campaign and to help us keep the Senate majority. Because of your early and sustained support, we were able to build a grassroots-focused campaign that met voters where they were, that cut through the noise and talked directly to the people of New Hampshire about my record of fighting for them. On Election Day, we saw the results of that hard work. Granite Staters chose common sense over extremism, and they stood strong for democracy and individual freedoms. I look forward to continuing to work together to ensure that our country remains a strong and powerful voice for diplomacy, democracy, and peace in the Middle East and around the world. Again, thank you so much, J Street, for your partnership. I look forward to continuing our work together.
Hi, J Street. It's Greg Casar, Congress member elect here from the heart of Texas. I want to thank you so very much for what you did in this election cycle, because voters all over the country showed up for candidates that were pro-peace, pro-human rights, pro-diplomacy, pro-economic and racial justice. And even in those races where there were millions of dollars in corporate money, even in those races where there was so much right-wing propaganda, good candidates were able to pull through. And that's how we build a Congress, but also an organized public to be able to deliver solutions for people that are struggling all over the world.
Hey, J Street. I hope you're enjoying your conference. I am Sydney Kamlager Dove, Congresswoman-elect for California's 37th Congressional District, and I will be representing the heart of Los Angeles. Woo-woo to Karen Bass for becoming our next and first female mayor. Thank you for your support in helping me get to Congress. Your LA contingent rocks with great values and constitution and honesty about the issues. I represent an incredibly diverse district, which includes an incredibly diverse Jewish community. And I have learned that listening and empathy are traits we need to revitalize. This was an historic election on so many fronts. Younger people came out in record numbers to vote. Democracy was on the ballot in important ways across so many states. And Democrats being in the minority by the slimmest of margins means that the American people want solutions over chaos, compromise over extremism, and they want every voice to be heard. They know that those voices include pro-peace, pro-democracy, pro-diplomacy policies with our allies. There is so much work to do. There is so much opportunity ahead. And I am grateful that J Street is at the table, pushing forward and pushing progress. Thank you so much and enjoy.
Cool. All right, good morning, J Street. And thank you to Ben and Tiffany for being here today. Here's my first question. So, heading into the midterm elections, so many of us in this room and online were deeply worried about the threat posed by right-wing extremists who seek to undermine the integrity of our elections, suppress voting rights, illegally gerrymander our electoral maps, and otherwise interfere and threaten the functioning of our democracy. As leaders working to help confront these threats, what do you think worked on Election Day and in the lead up? What are the key successes that the pro-democracy movement can point to? And Tiffany, I'm going to start with you.
Wonderful. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here today. Our partnership with J Street throughout the years has been really critical to defending democracy and helping elect champions across the country who will fight for our democratic values, both at the federal and state level. And Tali, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you and Ben. So look, we had a good night on election night, right? Yes, exactly. We should keep applauding that. I think this feeling we're all having is hope, and it's great. And in the 3 months leading up to the election, I traveled all over the country, 27,000 miles campaigning with 53 candidates, and got to see firsthand how concerned voters were on the ground about protecting our democracy. And that played out at the ballot box, right? From the clean sweep in our battleground Secretary of State and Attorneys General races, where we defeated election deniers across the country, to flipping a Senate seat in Pennsylvania, to defending important incumbent governors across the country, including in Wisconsin. We even flipped state legislatures across the country in a midterm, which is pretty unheard of. And that's because voters cared about democracy. We would go around and we would say, democracy is on the ballot. And there were a lot of folks who frankly were a little skeptical about whether or not voters cared enough about that to have that influence their vote in the ballot box. And the voters proved them wrong, right? Voters showed that democracy was front and center in their mind when they walked into that ballot box. And that's great. We can continue to build on that. We have to continue to build on that because some of those threats that we were talking about in 2022 are still there, right? We have still seen in the past 2 years 80 voter suppression bills go into effect that absolutely impacted Black and brown communities' turnout in 2022. We know that these are the most fair maps we've seen in 70 years in the House, and yet Republicans are still starting with a gerrymandered disadvantage that allowed them to hold the House majority when frankly we should have been able to win it. So we're gonna have to continue to fight the corruption of dark money, the gerrymandered maps, the voter suppression, and the attacks on our democracy. So our work here as a community isn't done, but we also know that we have done a great job in making sure that voters understand the urgency of the moment that we are in. And one last thing, Tali, is that we actually just got our post-election survey back, and we asked voters, was this election more or less important than others in your lifetime? And 2/3 of them said more important. And when asked why, just open-ended, why was this election more important? The vast majority of them said democracy first. So that really was playing out across the country.
Ben, do you want to speak a little bit about the key successes of the pro-democracy movement?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Tali. Thank you, Tiffany, for your amazing, amazing work. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. And thanks to Jeremy and the whole J Street community. The work of J Street to build and support democracy and peace and justice in Israel is interlinked inextricably with the work to ensure we have a democracy in the United States. And I'm proud to have been an enthusiastic J Street supporter since in different capacities at Move On and other roles through the years. But when I moved home to Wisconsin to join the fight for democracy in my home state, it has been extraordinary to me to see how J Street works in strategic races and strategic places across the country. It's a critical part of the infrastructure of preserving and expanding the idea of American democracy here. So thank you. And I want to just zero in on Wisconsin. This was a state that's been the tipping point in both of the last 2 presidential elections. We were the state that, put Trump over the top, and then put Biden over the top by 0.6 percentage point. And Wisconsin, it's an iron rule that the party of the president loses the midterms. The last time a Democratic governor candidate won in Wisconsin when there was a Democratic president in the White House was 60 years ago. In 1962, JFK's approval rating when they got to election day was 70%, and the Democratic candidate for governor won by 1 point that year. So we went in thinking, it's worth a shot. We wanted to do everything we possibly could. We have Governor Tony Evers, who's a great and decent governor. And then Republicans in our state Supreme Court actually basically overrode the governor's veto and chose the most extreme gerrymandered map in the United States of America in our state legislature. So Republicans were on track to get 2/3 supermajorities in both chambers of our state legislature. And their united goal, both the Republican Trump-endorsed candidate Tim Michels for governor and the Republicans running in state legislature, was to scrap our bipartisan election administration system, put partisans in charge, and be able to rewrite the rules so that, as the Republican candidate said on the campaign trail in the final weeks, after he was elected governor, no Republican would ever lose again. And it wasn't clear if we'd be able to stop them. And there was an enormous effort by so many people. We broke our own records for organizing in a midterm. Every ally, the work of J Street members, the whole J Street organization, and so many others, labor, grassroots groups, young voters, we defied history. We won the governor's race by 3.4 percentage points. In the state legislature, Republicans came within less than 0.1% of the votes cast, 2,499 votes in the right districts. Republicans would have gotten dual chamber supermajorities, but we stopped them there too. And in our Senate race, which people had thought was totally out of reach, we had the great J Street endorsed candidate Mandela Barnes running for Senate. He is a champion. He just turned 36. In Wisconsin, also no Democrat had beaten an incumbent Republican senator in a midterm with a Democratic president since that 1962 election. And on election night, the New York Times said he was going to lose by 3.9 points with their needle. And after being outspent by $27 million, he lost by 26,000 votes. So he demonstrated the power of this movement, even when all the political science and the projections say it's impossible. And we saw this in Arizona, we saw this in Pennsylvania, we saw this in Michigan, we saw this in enough states that Trump's coup plan won't work this time. He will not have the power to overturn the election results in 2024. And that is a giant, giant triumph in a moment of extreme peril that everyone here played a role in making possible.
Thank you. And we obviously touched on this already. The results in the midterms were better than a lot of us expected, thankfully, and thanks to the work that everyone in this room and on this stage was doing. And we talked about this already, but I'd love to hear specifically what messages you think resonated with voters on the issue of democracy. I know you talked a little bit about democracy being on the ballot, but coming from a fierce battleground state, Ben, do you want to sort of hammer in on what messages resonated most with voters?
Absolutely. So our governor, his core attribute as a candidate is that he does the right thing. So actually the governor's campaign chose the message doing the right thing for Wisconsin, and we contrasted that with the radical, divisive extremism of Tim Michels. And what we found in both the Senate and the governor's race is that democracy was actually a key proof point for a broader message about the character of the candidates. They say it's not what the candidates say about the issues, it's what the issues say about the candidates. And the Republicans, Ron Johnson was part of the fake elector scheme. He tried to hand fake electors to Mike Pence on the floor of the Senate on January 6th. In our governor's race, the Republican supported our complete ban on abortion that was passed in 1849. It was supposed to be a distant memory, but is now under litigation. Our great Attorney General, Josh Kaul, is suing to strike down that ban. So we had an argument that was essentially, these Republicans are against democracy. They want the power to overturn elections. They want to rip away your freedom to make your own decisions about your own body. And they're out for their own power and not for you. It's like, whose side are you on? And our candidates were on the side of regular people. And that worked. And as you said, there were all these people saying, no, we should just talk about inflation. Well, inflation, the economy, they were part of this message. But it did, the idea of democracy helped illustrate that these are people that were not on the side of the voters. And ultimately, voters want to have someone who will be their champion. Democracy is a core part of that. And that message worked up and down the ballot. I'm so glad so many people decided to lean in on it despite what the chattering classes were saying.
Great. Tiffany, what?
Yeah, that's what we saw across the country as well playing out, which is that voters really did care about this sense of election denialism and this idea that these candidates would do something so unfair as to just try to overturn an election and overturn the will of the voters. It went against the very core values that Americans believe in, and they really paired it with other extremism that we were seeing candidates push across the country. So extremism on abortion bans, extremism on book banning, extremism around LGBTQ attacks. It was this sense of like, okay, I don't love the Democrats and I'm upset about inflation and economic costs, but these guys over here, look at what they're doing. Like, that is not okay. And that was the choice that really played out across the country. And so I think, Ben, you're exactly right. It was good that contrast was there and that we made sure voters knew about it. We have to continue to make sure voters know about it because those threats to our elections, the election denialism, I don't think that's going away. We still have a GOP caucus in Congress where more than half of them voted to overturn the 2020 election, right? This idea of the big lie just going away isn't going to happen. Now, thankfully, we have put people and champions in place, Secretary of State candidates in Michigan and Arizona and Nevada and across the state who are going to defend the voters and defend the certification of elections. But we saw just in the last couple of weeks, certain counties trying to deny certification of elections. So we haven't completely knocked this out, We have to continue to beat them at the ballot box to make sure that we do knock that out completely. But I think that that's what we're seeing.
That leads right into my next question. Sort of, I was looking back on this past cycle, but looking to 2024, what tactics do you think the right wing is really going to double down on? What lessons are they taking from this election, and what should we be thinking about going into 2024?
Well, you would hope that after being handed their worst midterm performance ever, that what they would do is step back and say, oh, how does what we are saying not align with where the voters are at, and let's take an autopsy on that. But sadly, I don't think that's what we're going to see, right? So instead, I think that you're going to see continued running to the right and to the extremism. Even in the runoff in Georgia, what we're continuing to see are attacks on elections, attacks on voters, attacks on the LGBTQ community, pushing for abortion bans, pushing for book banning, these culture wars that frankly many voters don't want to have anything to do with, and that it goes against their very sense of who we are as Americans and our democracy. I think we're going to continue to see that. The other thing we saw was across the country, we saw really fringe candidates being upheld by dark money. They were only competitive in some of these races because they had all this outside special interest dark money that was propping them up. You know, folks like Blake Masters in Arizona or Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, or to your point, right, like how much Ron Johnson's dark money came in to save him. So the people were with the Democratic candidates. The people were with Mandela Barnes. The people were with Maggie Hassan. And had it just been the two candidates running against each other, that would have been a much different scenario. But this dark money and special interest money that was coming in to prop them up allowed them to run these competitive campaigns when really the candidates themselves didn't have to do anything. We're going to continue to see that as well. So we all as a community who care about these things have to continue to double down on supporting the candidates that we all supported in 2022 and that frankly are going to be up in 2024 as well, that we know are going to defend every single day our democracy in office.
Thank you. And what are your sort of biggest takeaways from what the right wing did and are going to continue doing?
So when I look at this election, one of the things that just I can't get out of my mind is that in our neighboring state of Michigan, they won a Supreme Court majority a couple of years ago. And I don't know if folks saw, the Supreme Court had to override a group of kind of election denialists in order to get their ballot initiatives on the ballot to protect abortion rights. And the state Supreme Court helped ensure that they could have a fair maps ballot initiative that actually took effect, and they had fair maps in this election. And Michigan is now a blue trifecta state, which is just extraordinary. Lavora Barnes, their state party chair, had a very good year, and she did amazing, amazing work. Wisconsin, a couple years ago, we had a state Supreme Court race, and a right-wing dark money group led by Karl Rove poured in money in the final week of that election. We lost by 6,000 votes. And because of that, Republicans have a majority in our state Supreme Court, chose these ultra-gerrymandered maps against the will of the electorate. So I think they're going to keep focusing on down-ballot races that have these long-term impacts. And our job is to fight back exactly at that level. And we have a state Supreme Court race coming up on April 4th of 2023. That's for an open seat that will determine the majority on our state Supreme Court. If we win that race, we could do a challenge like Pennsylvania did after they won the state Supreme Court there, declare our maps unconstitutional, get new maps in Wisconsin, and become an actual democracy where as soon as 2024, we could be like Michigan, we could win a blue trifecta. So Leonard Leo, the dark money groups are going to be pouring their attention into these races that have long-term consequences that affect who makes the rules of our democracy. And I think our job is to fight back like everything rides on these races that are far from the spotlight, including, folks, mark your calendars, Wisconsin, April 4th, 2023.
Right. That's very soon. This is not an off year.
I want to follow up on something Ben said there. Leonard Leo isn't running out of money anytime soon either. I don't know if you all saw it, but he just got the largest political donation in the history of our country. It was $1.6 billion. $1.6 billion to build a right-wing conservative network to go into states like Wisconsin, like Arizona, like other places, and fight on this local level to stack school boards and county commissions and Supreme Courts and to fight ballot measures that would expand our democracy. So we know what we're up against, right? We know what that number is, and we know what the thing I believe is more powerful than their $1.6 billion check is all of us coming together in community, because we've proven time and time again that that is more powerful and that we can win when we do that.
Thank you. So with just a few minutes left, I'd love for each of you to tell all of us in this room, activists, advocates, leaders, what should we be doing looking to 2024? How can we be a part of this critical pro-democracy movement? Tiffany, if you want to start.
Well, you're doing it right now, right? You're showing up, you're being here, you're being in community, you're having these conversations. You are supporting candidates who each and every day are going to bring those values to the offices that they serve in. So first, thank you. You are already doing it. But we need more people, because they are not going to back down. They are going to continue to get more and more money. And the forces that we are facing are really dangerous, right? They have taken us to a precipice, and it feels like we can take a breath after 2022, but it doesn't mean we can quit fighting. We are not safe, right? They are going to continue these anti-democratic attacks because they believe it is the only way that they can achieve power. We know that the way that we can fight back against that is truly by coming together. That what is more powerful than their big dark money or their anti-democratic attacks is all of us joining forces and coming together and supporting candidates who will fight against that, and then going out and getting our friends and family to vote and to register to vote and to be involved in these races. Here's the other thing. All the people that you just helped elect, what was it, 125, right? Congratulations, by the way, that's incredible. Each and every one of them need to continue to hear from you in the coming months and in the coming years about why democracy is so important, and what that you need them to continue fighting for it. Because it's really easy when you're here in Congress to just deal with whatever's right in front of you. And so what you have to do is make sure that what stays right in front of them is the concern about democracy, so that they will continue to fight for it each and every day.
Thank you. And just if you want to wrap a message to this group, what should we be doing?
I love that we're all here after the midterm election, because the core lesson, I think, of these last few years is that there are no off years. What happens in Wisconsin on April 4th, there's that date again. What happens in the fall races in places like Virginia, what happens throughout next year, organizing on the ground, advocating on our issues, but also staying engaged in races that Republicans hope you never hear about, it's gonna make all the difference in the world. The right is very strategic because they know that rigging the system is their only path back to power, which means we have to be even more strategic because we have the people power. And if everyone in this room and all the people that we can recruit and all the millions of people who share our values across the country fight back, democracy will not only survive, it's going to thrive this century in America and Israel.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you guys for being here. And we're gonna head off.
Please welcome J Street's Vice President of Communications, Logan Bayroff.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with my panelists. Leah Greenberg on my left is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Indivisible Project, one of the largest grassroots progressive organizations in the country that does amazing work. And on my right, someone who perhaps needs no introduction, Ruth Messenger. You've had a legendary career in the Jewish community and New York politics as a leading advocate for social and racial justice. So, we've been discussing how this has been obviously a critical election cycle for American democracy. And of course, as we've discussed, 2022 saw a massive amount of mobilization from Jewish Americans, including pro-Israel groups and PACs, on behalf of candidates who vowed to defend our democratic freedoms and values. And we've spoken about all that J Street PAC did We had our J Street Action Fund working in Democratic primaries to support pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy candidates. So we did a great deal this cycle. And yet, I think in terms of overall spending and in terms of controversy, probably the most talked about intervention in this election cycle came from AIPAC. While their new federal PAC endorsed 109 of the Republican candidates who voted to overturn the results of the presidential election on January 6th, their new super PAC, the ironically named United Democracy Project, spent nearly $30 million exclusively to target progressive Democratic candidates in the primaries and later in the general election when they spent about $1 million targeting Democrat Summer Lee right before the general election in November. So, Leah, I want to start with you. What do you think the goal of this political intervention by AIPAC and its backers was? How successful do you think it was? And as a progressive leader working with candidates and activists across the country, how did you see its impact in this cycle? And how did you see progressives and liberals working together to push back?
Thanks, Logan. It's great to be here with you all. I would say that the goal was twofold. First was to shape this incoming class of Democratic congresspeople, right, to get them to be more aligned with AIPAC's policy positions, and also to have a longer-term deterrent effect on future folks who might think about running for office and how outspoken they are going to be on this issue, what positions they're going to take, raising the risks that as they are involved, there is going to be this, a significant infusion of cash spent against them. And I would note this was part of a broader trend. Several different major actors who are not invested, I should note, in the health of the Democratic Party or in the future of Democratic majorities were very involved in spending enormous amounts of money in Democratic primaries this cycle. It wasn't just AIPAC, it was also crypto. It was also a set of corporate and Silicon Valley interests who put sums of money that are just unprecedented in Democratic primaries in. And what we saw was, as one of a number of folks who have partnered with J Street and with other folks involved in primaries and along with our local indivisible groups who support these candidates on the ground, was that there was sort of a ratio, right, where if you could, we expect to get outspent, but if you could keep it to 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, you had a really good chance of winning. Once you get to 5-to-1, some of the sums of money that we were seeing in this cycle were just sort of difficult to overcome with folks like Nita Alum or Donna Edwards. Now, I should also add, when we talk about the goals of this originally, in spite of the name United Democracy Project, the goal was not to promote democracy or to promote a Democratic majority. And those two things are inherently linked in a period of time when the Republican Party is dominated by election deniers. So what we saw was, again, all of these folks, both AIPAC and then crypto and all these other folks, they were investing heavily to shape this incoming class, but they were not actually showing up to defend a Democratic majority. And as an organization that we get involved in primaries, but we're 100% clear that when the primary is over, you get behind the general election candidate because that is how you protect our democracy. That was not what we saw on the other side. When we saw them throwing in against Summer Lee in the general election, that was in a moment when the House was incredibly close and every seat mattered. That was money spent to promote a Republican majority in the House, a Republican majority that is now incoming and that we should all be clear will be dominated by the voices that are the loudest, the most dangerous, some of the most anti-Semitic, right? Kevin McCarthy may or may not get the gavel, but Marjorie Taylor Greene will be running the show in this House. And we should be really clear that the folks who were pushing to shape the character of the Democratic Party in the primary did not raise a finger to help, and in some cases actually made it harder for us to hold that majority in the general.
So, Ruth, we spoke about, you've had an incredible and distinguished career in the Jewish community on so many issues. Israel and pro-Israel politics is not the area you've typically focused on, but in August, you co-authored a piece in The Nation in which you strongly criticized AIPAC's actions, and you wrote that, quote, "It has been outrageous to see some of the most politically engaged Jewish Americans, including AIPAC and its allies, taking steps that effectively weaken our democracy by engaging in unlimited spending to overwhelm unaligned candidates, supporting candidates who are opposed to democratic laws and norms, and seeking to limit free speech if it is critical of Israel." So I wanted to ask, why are these actions and endorsements by AIPAC and their allies so concerning to you, and why did you decide it was important to speak out publicly about them?
Okay, so thank you. I want to say before I answer your question, first of all, I want to just do a shout out to the ongoing work of Indivisible, which I think has been extraordinary in reminding us that democracy and democratic values are at the lowest level and bubble up, and that's where we make change. And then I want to do a great shout out to J Street and to everybody here who worked in these elections and worked for the advance of democracy, which is, of course, part of the answer to my question, to your question. But I also want to just say, Ben did a fantastic job in Wisconsin, and he did a great job of reminding you about the April election. But there's an election on Tuesday, and it is possible to sign on tonight and make calls to voters in Georgia, and you should do it. I spent more hours on the phone. Anyway, but I think really the answer to your question, Logan, is in the question. What I care, in some way, I've discovered through a lot of different wonderful pieces of my career in the Jewish community, out of the Jewish community, that what I care about most fundamentally is social justice and democracy. And so the issue here was, I love J Street, but the issue here was that AIPAC was clearly doing things. And I want to say they have a right to support whatever candidates they want, but the choices that they were making, I saw as subverting democracy, subverting democratic values, using the power of money, which is what Leah just talked about, to make it impossible for grassroots efforts to succeed, and doing that in the name of AIPAC. And that was incredibly distressing to me, so I decided to get involved. And my co-author is Mick Moore, whom many of you know, but who was, it was his initiative that said we should do this piece.
So Leah, you just spoke a little bit about, that this wasn't just AIPAC. I mean, it's part of a broader story of really aggressive outside spending, but I think the common theme is spending in Democratic primaries and on elections by groups that don't necessarily have any either large D or small d Democratic goals and priorities at heart. You mentioned crypto. I think the second biggest spender after United Democracy Project was the crypto, now former billionaire, Sam Bankman-Fried, who spent very aggressively before his fortune evaporated and he faced investigation. But this is not going away, right? We're going to continue to see this kind of spending, presumably from AIPAC and other groups. They want to drive a particular agenda, and it's not that small d Democratic agenda. So how do you think that Democratic leaders and groups in the pro-liberal democracy camp should be responding to all this outside spending going forward, when that spending does seem to be unaligned with the goals that we all share, including the goal of sort of winning elections in November?
Well, I think we all have to recognize primaries as a strategic lever, which is something that is hard for folks who are, we're thinking about not only the primary, but also the general. How do we use resources in the primary? How do we use them in the general? You have to make tough choices about allocation, all of that. But we have to realize that these primaries are really important in terms of shaping the character of the Democratic Party going forward, right? Even before this massive influx of cash, there was already a challenge where, folks, in order to become competitive for some of these places, it helped to have, the ability to write yourself a check for a couple $100,000, and that means that you're going to get more folks who own 10 used car dealerships, and fewer folks who are teachers or union organizers, the kinds of people who would actually be an investment in the brand of the Democratic Party, an investment in like the ambassador for the Democratic Party for decades going forward. Because that's the other thing. These are investments often in safe seats. If you get elected, unless you do something really, really wacky, you're probably going to stay in office as long as you want. And so this is about not just the next year and the next Congress, but it's about 10 years from now. It's about who is going to be competitive as a Senate or gubernatorial candidate in the future. So it's really, I think the other side has recognized very early that this was a really important tool that they needed to put a significant amount of resourcing into. But the other thing, longer term, is that I think the Democratic Party has to get a handle on this, right? Because one, we don't want an arms race in the primaries going on. We do want to put those resources into the general election. And also, it's not helpful to have dark money forces, determining the outcomes in these primaries in ways that are counter to the Democratic Party interests. There was a resolution that came up at the DNC earlier about limiting expenditures by outside groups or creating some restrictions on expenditures by outside groups this summer. It did not pass, but there really could be, concerted action, and we could be moving forward collectively to say, this is simply not the way that we're going to choose our next class of leaders.
I want to add to everything that Leah said before you ask another question, just to remind again that the point that Ben was making. We're focused here, as we should, and as we all pay a lot of attention to Congress and what's shaping Congress now and for the future. But this is, on the part of the people that we're working against, going all the way down to every local state race. And it really becomes important to understand you can't do all 50 states, but you can learn about down ballot races. You can look at we actually did okay in November, but at the successes of affirmative Democratic, small d Democratic secretaries of state, as opposed to the fierce push in many states to elect people who will pursue the effort to deny people their voting rights.
So, one thing I wanted to ask is, you look at this cycle overall, and we see a prominent, group like AIPAC, on the one hand, standing with and endorsing folks like Jim Jordan and Scott Perry and Elise Stefanik, and on and on and on, these sort of people who are spouting, white nationalist rhetoric, great replacement theory in some cases, certainly the big lie about the 2020 election. And then we see them, on the other hand, spending tens of billions of dollars targeting, fairly mainstream progressive Democrats, folks like, Andy Levin, but also a lot of leaders of color in a lot of these races. You mentioned Summer Lee, you mentioned Donna Edwards. I just wonder, what do we think, what is the overall impact of sort of the message that is sending, when we sort of see, on the one hand, saying, well, our friends are these far-right bigots, and on the other hand, targeting folks. In many cases, it's hard to really see why, but disproportionately targeting people who come from other communities, from vulnerable minority communities.
Well, come from other communities, vulnerable minorities, and it's a check mark for American democracy that people from some of these marginalized communities are making the serious effort to enter elected office, which I, needless to say, feel very strongly about, and really trying to advance. And we're trying to look for the broadest possible spectrum of, again, people espousing democratic values who get elected to office. So when it appears, as it did in this election, that the AIPAC money, first of all, was going to this large number of Republicans who had literally just supported the January 6th movement, and then was around the country in races just somehow, again, that's the way they would say it, but targeting people of color. The Donna Edwards, Summer Lee, Congresswoman Summer Lee, yes. But the question, every place that Summer Lee has, every email she's sent, every place I've heard her speak, she says very quietly, I won against a very large sum of dark money, Republican money. And what we're saying here is, yes, but what is the image that sends about dark money, about Republicans, and about AIPAC? Because AIPAC, as a Jewish organization, I want them, which is really the thrust of this piece, to recognize the strong connection that Jamie made last night, but between democracy and Judaism. We are a people who have been protected by democracies throughout history, and we need to stand for and advance, protect, let's say first, protect and advance and enhance the strength of democracy in this country. And when it constantly seems that we're not, and that an organization is putting down people of color and advancing people who have spoken out against fair democratic elections, that sends an incredibly dangerous message.
Yeah, I would also add, this is also about kind of where is the mainstream of American Jews, right? And what interests are being represented by an organization coming in and spending a ton of money for candidates who are anti-choice, for candidates who are election deniers, or for candidates who are election deniers, or to tip the House to candidates who are election deniers. I think one of the things that we really appreciate about J Street is this move to say we are in favor of democracy, right? Like we're actually, as part of our interests, as part of our values, we're promoting democracy here in this country. And that is so crucial and so important because in this moment, that is what the mainstream of American Jews are looking for in leadership. We are, in a moment when there's just enormous anti-Semitism rising, particularly driven by right-wing political and media figures. You have to be really realistic about who is actually representing and promoting the kind of leadership that will stand against anti-Semitism in all of its forms.
Yeah, and I should say on that note, so I think we've mentioned it maybe a bit at the conference already, but J Street recently did our election night polling of Jewish Americans, and we polled Jewish Americans and asked if they approved of what AIPAC did in terms of endorsing candidates who voted against the certification of the election on January 6th, but who say that they're pro-Israel, and 72% of Jewish Americans said, no, we disapprove of that action. So we do have, in fact, the numbers to show that this just simply is not representative of where the community
and
is.
It's critical that J Street did that work and then came up with that evidence. But what I want to say to everybody here is which I know everyone knows, but democracy is not a spectator sport. And it requires endless ongoing activity and commitment. And we want to believe, and I do believe, that J Street, in addition to advancing its extraordinary positions on Mideast politics, cares about all of these other things. But I want to say to each of us, we have essentially a voter responsibility. And that is to know where the candidates that we choose to invest in and that we choose to vote for stand on a range of issues. And accepting, pick your progressive cause, accepting the word of X, I'll say Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood will tell me exactly which candidates in any race are the most strongly protective of a woman's right to choose. But I need to know where those candidates stand on other issues that matter to me, or I become myself a kind of one-issue person. So it requires homework. It requires serious investigation. And the most exciting thing about J Street is that it's made this broad commitment to endorse and enhance small candidates who care about small d democratic values in a country in which they are astoundingly under threat.
So we're going to wrap this panel in a moment, but just to maybe end on a high note, we've talked about some of the impact of AIPAC and UDP's spending in this cycle, but we also talked about the ways that groups like J Street and Indivisible and a lot of others pushed back. And Leah, I'm wondering, as you look towards the next Congress and look at some of the new voices and faces who are coming in, how excited are you about where we shook out and what sort of the future of the Democratic caucus looks like? Are there people that you're particularly excited about seeing in the next Congress? And how are you feeling in terms of the overall effort? And are we going to have good, strong, sort of pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy champions going forward?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say, I want to emphasize, while this kind of sum of money was significant, that did not mean that they consistently won their races, right? So we are seeing some really incredible champions who are going to come in. The Congressional Progressive Caucus is going to be the largest it's ever been in this incoming Congress. We're seeing, I think we're really, we're going to be facing a period of time where there'll be a divided government, there'll be a really important moment for Democrats to tell a story about what they stand for, what they represent, what is at stake in the future, again, as we continue to face this increasingly anti-democratic Republican Party. And so I'm super hopeful for what is possible to achieve, what's possible to achieve working with the Biden administration, and for the ways in which the incoming leadership is really going to shape our party going forward.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you to both Ruth and Leah. And I really enjoyed this panel.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks so much to Tiffany and Ben and Tali. Thanks to Logan and Ruth and Leah. Those were fascinating conversations and I think really got us off on the right track discussing the challenges to democracy here in the US. So here we were able to celebrate a victory and certainly forward progress on election night, but I can't unfortunately say the same for Israel and its election results. Benjamin Netanyahu is returning to power with what is likely to be the most hardline government in Israel's history. He's determined to cut the power of the Supreme Court, avoid conviction on corruption charges, and he's cut deals with some very, very extreme politicians. And I think you know the names, you understand the issues, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Avi Maoz. These are demagogues, and they have made clear their contempt for Palestinian rights, for LGBTQ plus Israelis, for Jewish pluralism, and for basic democratic norms. So this is a very, very unprecedented time. It's a scary time, but there are a lot of terrific and wonderful, brave Israelis who are mobilizing to defend their vision of what Israel can be, a just and an equal and a democratic Israel. And I hope that you're getting a chance to meet a lot of them here today, both out in the halls at the exhibits, but also in the breakout sessions. In our next session, we're going to hear from Eran Nissan and Reut Moore, who are both from the Citizens HQ. It's a nonpartisan activist network, and they are focused on monitoring and documenting the challenges of right-wing tactics of fear and division for Israel's democracy. After them, we'll be hearing from two really amazing Jewish leaders and teachers. The executive director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, Noah Satat, and Rabbi David Saperstein, who's a senior advisor for policy and strategy for the Union of Reform Judaism. They will speak about some of the Jewish values and traditions that lie at the heart of our movement's commitment to fight for democracy and justice, both here in Israel and at home, and what Americans and Israelis can learn from each other in our joint struggles. To set the stage for the presentation from Eran and Reut from Citizens HQ, you're going to see a few slides taking us back to one of the more concerning moments of Israel's recent history, which is the escalation of Israeli-Palestinian violence that took place not just in the occupied territory, but also in the mixed cities within Israel itself during the May 2021 escalation. So let's roll the slides, and please join me in welcoming to the stage Eran and Reut.
Just see the slides. Fantastic. Thank you. During April and May of 2021, planned evictions of Palestinian residents in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah further destabilized an already volatile situation in Israel and Palestine. The unrest in Jerusalem quickly escalated and turned into violent clashes throughout the West Bank, a war in Gaza, and for the first time since the Second Intifada, widespread violence in Israeli cities between Jews and Arabs.
The messages you saw are a translation of an actual conversation in a WhatsApp group monitored in real time by two organizations, the Democratic Bloc and the Fake Reporter, who regularly work together as part of an innovative partnership called the Citizens HQ. Shalom, everyone. It's an honor to be on this stage. My name is Reut Moore. I'm a political strategist and a communication advisor, and one of the co-founders and the co-directors of the Citizens HQ.
My name is Eran Nissan. I'm an Israeli peace activist. I'm the CEO of Mechazkim, a progressive digital movement, and I also manage government relations at the Citizen HQ. We are here to tell you about the Citizen HQ, what we do, how we work, and how it is relevant to both Israelis and Americans who strive to defend democracy and progressive values. As the violent events of 2021 unfolded, we realized that the monitoring project of the far right instantly became a direct look into how a modern-day lynch mob is being organized. This was only 4 months after January 6th, and it is easy to draw comparisons when you see the footage of right-wing armed thugs pushing against and breaking through police barriers with hate in their eyes. The materials and information we gathered from the chat groups were used by law enforcement to indict and convict perpetrators of violence.
Our first goal was de-escalation and the prevention of violence. Our second goal was to also influence the public narrative and the nature of coverage. It is precisely in difficult times like those that public, political, and social perceptions are built. This was critical, but not enough. Political parties had already started to taking advantage of the violence, trying to create a rift between Jewish and Arab citizens. Standing together, an Arab-Jewish movement and the most significant field movement in the Israeli left, also a core member in the HQ, had embarked on a large field operation to bring thousands of Jews and Arabs to stand together in resistance and in solidarity in hundreds of places all over the country. In the face of violence, we were able to work together and encourage more and more bodies and groups to come out with message of partnership, equality, democracy. As soon as the violence stopped, standing together, we were able to organize the largest demonstration at the time, with thousands of people came together in Tel Aviv for a joint Jewish-Arab call for partnership, equality, and peace.
The Citizen HQ is the headquarters for the people. We established the Citizen HQ in order to present a new work model for civil society and the democratic camp, a model that is based on effectiveness, that is agile and flexible, that can react to the developing things on the ground and also act in times of emergency. The HQ includes 5 organizations united around shared values: peace, equality, democracy, and the understanding that Israel's future is dependent on Jewish-Arab partnership. Citizen HQ was founded not to carry out one campaign or to tackle a specific injustice or disparity, but rather with the explicit objective of building political power and laying the infrastructure and the foundations for a large center-left Jewish-Arab political camp.
The organizations that make up the foundational work of the HQ are one who deal with broad issues relevant to the progressive camp, and each of them specialized in a certain area or capacity. Standing Together, a Jewish-Arab movement which specialized in community organizing. The Democratic Bloc specialized in campaign strategy, media relation, and opposition research. Mechazkim managed the strongest social media operation for distributing political content online. Shatil, as the capacity-building arm of the New Israel Fund, has deep relationship and network experience across Israel's civil society landscape. And Fake Reporter, who lead the fight in Israel against disinformation, hate speech, and violence online.
When we established the HQ 4 years ago, we looked across the aisle and we saw a political camp that was very effective. The right-wing civil society in Israel is well-funded and works in complete sync with the political parties. At that time, Israel's liberal and progressive civil society was under severe attack, fragmented, and on the defense. We wanted to optimize our defense, but also build the capacity to go on the offense, to initiate, to be proactive, to set the agenda. Also, we understood that we need to get to know our opponents much better. And therefore, one of our specialties is opposition research. The Democratic Bloc helped journalists with an opposition study exposing the Kohelet Policy Forum and its two main American donors, Jeffrey Yass and Arthur Danchik, to the Israeli public. Arthur Danchik and Jeffrey Yass used funds to import right-wing ideas from the United States into Israel. The donations that the Kohelet Policy Forum gets is bigger than any organization in this conference.
Some of these ideas, such as opposition to abortion and support for libertarian economic concept, were very foreign to the Israeli public. Mechazkim led the public campaign on this issue in order to ensure that Israeli citizens know that these new ideas didn't just suddenly appear in the Israeli discourse. The crisis and threat to the democratic space is global. And while there are major differences between threats in the US versus Israel, there are also similarities, but not only in the dangers, but also in the possible solutions. Part of the solution is strengthening our ability to work together. Our opponents are better than us in their ability and their commitment to work together, and this must change.
Imagine the Citizen HQ as an orchestra. Each organization has a specific relevant expertise which it brings to the stage. We can accompany others in their performances, we can play together, but we can also solo away and lead campaigns as autonomous organizations. This unique and innovative ensemble allows us to cooperate with more than 50 organizations in many different genres of collaborations.
In Israel, an extreme right-wing government is about to be sworn in. Ministers who support Jewish supremacy and the deepening of the occupation to apartheid are about to get in key positions. Structural changes that threaten the checks and balances between the different government branches are both imminent and concrete. The concerns for the future are unfortunately very real and tangible. But it's precisely in times like this that we have to stand together, fight together, and not to give up.
We will not always agree on everything. Some of us in the HQ are social democrats and some are liberals. Some are more moderate, some are more radical. We are Jews and Arabs, we vote to different parties. But just like the political camp we envision is wide and diverse, the HQ brings together different instruments in order to create a whole which is bigger than the sum of its parts. When many of our values are being threatened and attacked, we need to work together, to be agile, and at times put our own organizational ego aside in order to harness the power necessary to achieve real political impact.
We are not prepared to give up or to bow to the extreme right. And we also see the opportunities that this extremism creates for us to bring more Israelis to be our allies, our partners in our fight for democracy and equality. The liberal, democratic, and progressive American Jewish community as a whole, and you here, has a decisive role in our ability to stand tall in the face of all these dangers. This is a period that requires us all to be more political, to sharpen our ideas, and resolute in our unequivocal support for partnership, equality, and democracy, and to do it together. Thank you.
Please welcome Ambassador Rabbi David Saperstein and Rabbi Noah Satat.
No, it's a great pleasure to be with you here today and have the opportunity to talk.
Always. So as we begin this discussion of Jewish values, I wanted to ask you what you thought the core Jewish values that were relevant to this time in Israel, in the US, around the world.
You know, I think for every person in this room, one of the reasons you're here is those core values are part of your vision of the world, of J Street's vision of the world. And I just have to say a word about Jeremy here. What an extraordinary visionary he was. I confess I'm a little biased. I knew his parents really well. They helped shape this extraordinary young man with their values and their love of Israel. His mother grew up in the congregation. My dad was a rabbi for 50 years. I was the rabbi and met Jeremy at my congregation when he was a second grader. So I have a particular stake in everything that Jeremy does in a sense of pride. Look, you know the values, the fundamental dignity of every human being based in the notion that we are created in the image of the divine. The fundamental equality of all people derived from the Agadic understanding. Why were we descended from one couple, Adam and Eve? Why was Adam made of the dust of the four corners of the earth? So that none of us can claim that the yichus, the merits of our ancestors was greater than anyone else's. We're all descended from the same couple, all brothers and sisters, or as the great medieval Agadic text, Yalkut Shimoni says, I call on heaven today to witness whether Jew or non-Jew, free person or slave, man or woman, the divine judges each of us by our actions. So the idea of freedom of choice, so indispensable to democracy. None of the ideas of the fates that played games with human destiny, as some schools of Greek thought, or Calvinist predestination, or even Catholic original sin. We're all born free to make our choices and held accountable. Our vision is, I've set before you this day the blessing and the curse, good and evil. I can tell you what you should do and why, but if my word is to live on earth, God, it seems as though God is saying, it will be because of the choices you make. The idea of the rule of law. When Nathan the prophet confronts David and says, thou art the one. When Ahab is confronted by Elijah over Naboth's vineyard, we're taught even the highest human ruler is held accountable to God's law. All of the rules of law in the Rambam's writings set out both the extraordinary powers of the key executive, but also the limitations of those. A message for whether we're talking about the last administration in this country or to Bibi Netanyahu, who I suspect seeks out of this election a get-out-of-jail card free. Here, the belief that the ger, the stranger in our midst, is entitled to the same benefits that the Jew has, the social benefits that a Jew has, and above all, what resonates throughout all of Jewish thought, that we are commanded to be rodfei shalom, pursuers of peace. Peace, not pax, not the absence of war, but of wholeness, of making whole, of healing, of really creating a world of justice and peace for all. These are the values that underlie democracy. These are the values to which J Street is committed. These are the values that animate the extraordinary work of one of Israel's greatest champions for gay rights and women's rights and the immigrant rights and the rights of non-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and is such an important leader in the battle against racism, now heading Israel's preeminent civil rights group. So Noah, here, what do you see in terms of the values? How do those values get applied to what are the significant challenges that Israel faces at this moment?
Yeah, so we come to these challenges. We're now at the shock and awe period of the Israeli government, which is very reminiscent of the 100 executive orders of the first days of the Trump administration, or even before that. So if you're feeling a little shell-shocked, I hear you. And what we've been doing at ACRI, ACRI is the only organization in Israel that advocates across the full scope of civil and human rights for anybody under Israeli jurisdiction. So we've spent the past few weeks really mapping every bill that has been proposed by members of the incoming coalition, position papers from the right-wing think tanks, in order to create a map of the threats that this government poses to democracy and human rights. And let me tell you, even if we prioritize only the things that would be irreversible, it is a long list, and it varies from the threats to the freedom of expression and freedom of protest, through the monitoring and the surveillance of protesters and increased police brutality under the new Ministry of Ben-Gvir. It goes to the banning of political representation of the Palestinian society in Israel through various judicial attempts. It, of course, pertains to the attempts to suppress the independence of the judiciary and the ongoing suppression of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And we're doing this mapping because while we understand that the threats we're facing will take generations to overcome. We've faced a defeat which will have disastrous impacts. But anything that we can mitigate, any risk that we can block, any threat that we can stop, will also have generations of impact. So our role now is more important than ever. We start every staff meeting and every post on Facebook with saying, we are ready. We are ready for this challenge, and we will be here to use every tool that we have in order to face the threats. And the threats are, thank you. And the threats are very much connected. So in my visit here, I've met with death penalty experts because there is talk about instituting death penalty in Israel. We've never had death penalty. We've been hearing about evangelical groups pouring millions of dollars into Israel in order to start an anti-abortion movement in Israel where we've never had one. So our stories are very connected, and we need to learn from each other. We need to support each other in the difficult years ahead.
So let me ask you to follow up on one of those in particular. I talked about the rule of law. And in the Jewish tradition, the structure during the time of the Sanhedrin was a kind of court that could make the final decisions. But even throughout Jewish history, the whole responsa system was functionally appeals court. The local authorities couldn't decide, or there was a difference of opinion, and it went up to somebody who was ruling on it because of their merit. Because they were wise and offered insight. So that really was an appeal. Now we see the entire structure of Israel's rule of law being threatened by those who would restrict the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. What would be the impact of that happening to civil rights and to democratic freedoms in Israel?
Because of the makeup of the Israeli system, where we have only one house of parliament and we have very little separation between the legislative and the executive branches, the Supreme Court is really the center check and balance on the Israeli government's policy, actions, legislation. And attempting to undermine that would have disastrous effects on the protection of minorities, all minorities in Israel, and the protection of the rule of law and the democratic structure. And what we know is that right now it looks like they're protecting the majority rule. But over time, once you undermine the judiciary, then the leaders will also damage the very structure of the election system. So it will only protect the majority rule right now, and not the majority rule of future generations. And I think that that's really the threat that we're facing. It will be multi-layered. There will be many stages to this, and we need to be paying attention. And while the Supreme Court has always been the chief protector of human rights and democracy in Israel, there's another central check and balance that we've always had, which was the American government. And that has really faded during the Trump administration. And now is the time for all of you, I'm looking at you, to push to bring that back. And that could have a vital impact on where we stand.
And I really think, look, we're going to hear from the Secretary of State soon. So this is, an extraordinary time to be thinking about that impact. The call that Jeremy laid out last night about trying to add some real heft to the accountability of Israel to American support really would be, I think, a significant step in the direction of achieving that. But in terms of the relationship of the two, I think that everyone has kind of caught up with the recognition from our perspective of the damage that this government can do to support from the United States and to support from the American Jewish community. Abe Foxman's kind of stunning setting down of the red lines of what would happen if Israel walks away from being a democratic country and the damage it would do to U.S.-Israel relations and the American Jewish community's relations. How much of a perception do the Israeli people have about that damage that could be done? How much concern do politicians have, even in what will be the governing coalition? And do they care, or do they just assume it's inevitable that they'll have American support?
I think that Israel is very used to taking American support for granted. And we now have a government that we've never had before. So it requires steps that have never been taken before. And I think that once that becomes clear, the impact will be dramatic. And again, we are in a blocking offensive here, and that's what we need to be focusing on, to thinking about the critical moments where we need to use all the levers that we can, and the US government opinion, statements, and action would be very, very significant, as well as the reaction of the American Jewish community. So I think that the veer towards the evangelicals was not because Israel didn't want the Jewish vote. It's because Israel assumed that they could do both. And if there's a demonstration that that is impossible, I think that the Jewish community voice will be much more impactful.
When we've read about things that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have said, particularly about Palestinians, both Israeli Arabs and the Palestinian community, the possibilities of significant restrictions, shutting down those organizations that stand up for those rights, not just in the Palestinian community, but they've been talking about shutting down human rights organizations of Israeli Jewish human rights organizations as well. What do you think politically actually they would be able to? Isn't it weird to be talking about Bibi Netanyahu is the left wing of a government of Israel here? What is really feasible that they could actually try to do, and what impact would it have on Israel if they succeed in fulfilling some of these values?
So how does it feel sitting on stage next to an existential threat?
Yeah.
Like it? So yeah, the right-wing government has already expressed the concern about human rights organizations. And I want to tell you that on the first day after the elections, we bought the billboards outside of the Supreme Court of Israel, and we said, we continue to fight for human rights. And that's where we position ourselves, in opposition to this government. And the fact that they see us Thank you. The fact that they see us as a threat means we're doing a great job. And I think that will continue to be the issue. I mean, I think that as long as we are providing resistance, the government will try to shut us down in different ways. In the past, legislation was about banning of raising funds or receiving funds or a special taxation on the organization that are promoting human rights, and that it now is the important time to understand that the resources of the human rights organizations in Israel are so limited that these attempts could have very devastating effects on our work. And that's why also this is a place where in the past the US government has intervened, and I'm wondering whether the US government and other governments will intervene as well.
Both in terms of the Palestinian human rights groups and the Jewish Israeli human rights.
The Palestinian human rights groups, and we have, I'll plug in a promo, we have a panel tomorrow about shrinking space, shrinking democratic space in Palestinian society, where we will talk extensively about the Palestinian human rights groups. The situation of the Palestinian human rights groups, they are currently designated terrorist organizations in the West Bank. They're not, there is a legal process about the Israeli designation that is still ongoing, but the organizations are open. The bank accounts are working, the staff is coming to the office, they're doing their vital work for human rights. And one of the great concerns is that now the government will try to take further action against the organizations, and again, here the support of the international community in any way possible is very significant.
And you know, this does seem to be an issue that is a global issue. It isn't just Israel, it isn't just the United States. The Freedom House that monitors human rights and democracy across the globe points out, with ebbs and flows every year, if you look from 1949 to 2006, there was a continuous growth of democracy and human rights, with back and forth. The midpoint continued to grow expansively. And in almost every year since 2006, that has reversed now, with the growth of autocracy across the globe, the restriction, the shrinking of a free press, of the right to protest, of democratic structures, the rule of law in country after country after country across the globe, and threats even in what we saw as some of the strongest democracies, including the United States, and the rise of right-wing groups in Europe as well, in right-wing parties getting stronger and stronger footholds in European countries. You know, we're blessed to have a Secretary of State who I was honored to serve under, who really has been extraordinary in his commitment to human rights, to protecting God's creation, fighting climate change, and ending the threats of nuclear war. It is an extraordinary moment in human history in which we're making decisions about Israel, about the United States, about the world that will have the most demonstrable impact on the future of humanity of any generation before us. So let's go forward with courage, for your agenda is an awesome agenda that can transcend challenges and smash limitations. And that belief in human rights, democracy, freedom, and peace is needed more now than ever before. God bless in everything that you do.
Thank you. And we are facing unprecedented threats, and we have a greater role than ever, and we are ready. This is our time to make a difference. Thank you.
It is indeed.
Friends, please remain in your seats. The program will resume momentarily. Friends and honored guests, please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
All right. Thank you again to our terrific panelists and presenters. That was really great. Thank you to Rabbi David Saperstein, Rabbi Satat, Eran, and Reut. They've underscored, of course, how alarming the current situation is, but they've also shown us how we can stand up together for democracy and draw resolve from the partnerships and our shared values. And I'm really excited that we're going to continue to dig into a lot of the issues in Israel this afternoon at our afternoon plenary, and I hope to see a standing room only crowd this afternoon as well. We're honored now to close out this morning's plenary with a keynote address from our nation's top diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken. When President Biden first took office in 2021, it was really exciting to see a number of longtime friends of J Street taking up senior roles in this country's national security and foreign policy establishment. Secretary Blinken has been a long-time and good friend of this organization and this movement, and some of you may remember that a decade ago he gave a keynote address to our conference in 2012 when he was the National Security Advisor for then Vice President Joe Biden. The Secretary and I go back a long way, not quite to second grade, as apparently David Saperstein remembers our connection, but it is just tremendously moving for me to see all that he has accomplished. It's also, I think, encouraging for all of us that at such a challenging time for the world and for our country, we have someone so capable and so smart and so determined who is overseeing our country's foreign policy. I know you're all eager to hear from the Secretary of State about the role of American leadership in this critical moment for the country and the world. Please join me in welcoming Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please take a seat. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning, J Street. Now, it's Sunday. The World Cup is on. New York Times probably awaits, and yet you're all here, and I am grateful for that. It's wonderful to see all of you. And to my friend, longtime friend, colleague Jeremy, thank you for inviting me back to J Street. More important, I want to thank you for your unflagging commitment to strengthening the relationship between the United States and Israel, and for your vision and leadership of J Street. This is a remarkable organization. As Jeremy said, I've been engaged with it in one way or another over many years, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to spend some time with you this morning. Another friend and colleague is here, Ambassador Solomon. Thank you for a lifetime of service from your days as a community organizer in Massachusetts, our nation's ambassador to Spain under President Obama, to now chairmanship of J Street's board. Thank you. And to my fellow speakers this morning, Ambassador and Rabbi Saperstein. I use both honorifics. Rabbi Satat, Ruth Messenger, thank you for embodying the principle of Tikkun Olam, not only in your work on Israel, but across the social justice causes that you championed, causes that our administration shares and is committed to defending and promoting with you at home as well as around the world, including LGBTQ rights and women's rights, religious freedom, the equality of all people before the law. Finally, to everyone here, thank you for the work that you're doing today, but also every day, to advance peace and democracy. Indeed, each of you embodies one of our democracy's unique strengths, the power of citizens to engage in our public debate and in our policy-making process. The enduring engagement of J Street, as well as other groups across the spectrum that we consult with regularly, including in recent days, continues to inform our thinking. Today what I hope to do is to talk a little bit about how our administration is working to advance the shared interests and values at the heart of the U.S.-Israel relationship in what is a very consequential time, by strengthening Israel's security, recognizing that no peace is possible or sustainable without a strong, secure Israel, deepening Israel's integration in the region and in the world, holding firm to the vision of two states for two peoples, opposing acts that diminish the long-term prospects of achieving that goal, and taking immediate steps to improve the lives of Israelis and Palestinians alike. Now, in the nearly 75 years since Israel's founding, the partnership between our two countries has broadened and deepened to touch virtually every aspect of our people's lives: renewable energy and biotech, vaccine research and space exploration, higher education and the arts. That partnership, and all that it's produced for the people of our nations and the world, has always been underwritten by the United States' ironclad commitment to Israel's security, a commitment that has never been stronger than it is today. Under President Biden, the United States is providing $3.3 billion annually in foreign military financing to Israel, as well as another $500 million in funding for missile defense, more than at any time in the history of our relationship. This is in keeping with the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding that the then Obama-Biden administration agreed with Israel, the largest ever security package in U.S. history. Our investment is crucial to guaranteeing Israel's qualitative military edge in the Middle East, buttressing Israel's right to defend itself against the ongoing threat posed by Hamas and other terrorist groups bent on taking the lives of Israeli civilians. Our security assistance to Israel is sacrosanct. We've also reinforced Israel's security through diplomacy. When hostilities between Israel and Militant Gaza escalated in May 2021, President Biden led intensive behind-the-scenes efforts that helped produce a ceasefire in 11 days. And when that ceasefire took hold, we moved swiftly to provide humanitarian and reconstruction aid for Gaza to meet the urgent needs of the Palestinians there and to help lower tensions. We also worked with Congress on a bipartisan basis to deliver an additional $1 billion in funding to replenish supplies for Israel's Iron Dome, the missile defense system that we developed together and that has saved countless lives. Our countries participate regularly in joint military exercises, research, weapons development. We hold regular strategic dialogues. And this cooperation allows us to collaborate in countering a range of regional threats, none graver than those posed by Iran. The Iranian regime routinely threatens to wipe Israel off the map and continues to provide weapons to terrorists and proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas that remain motivated, like Iran, by the rejection of Israel's right to exist. In recent months, more and more countries are realizing that what we have long known about the Iranian regime's propensity to sow violence and instability. We see this daily as the regime is once again viciously cracking down on peaceful protesters at home, killing hundreds of its own people, including scores of women and children, and locking away thousands more in its brutal prisons. At the same time, the regime is arming and training Russian forces with drones that President Putin is using to kill Ukrainian civilians and destroy the infrastructure that provides millions of families with heat, with water, with electricity, just as winter is setting in. The United States is committed to standing with the Iranian people, especially women, as they demonstrate extraordinary courage in standing up for their rights. We are licensing technology so that Iranian citizens can communicate with one another, as well as remain connected to the outside world, despite the regime's constant internet blockages and shutdowns. And we're coordinating with allies and partners to sanction those responsible for the abuses against Iranian civilians, including the killing of Mahsa Amini. The regime's actions have only deepened our conviction that Iran must never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. We continue to believe that the best way to ensure this is through diplomacy. The benefits of this approach are borne out by the facts. Before the previous administration unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, Iran's nuclear program was in a box. Iran was abiding by its commitments on the agreement. Its nuclear program was the most rigorously monitored and verified in history. The breakout time needed for Iran to acquire enough fissile material to produce a nuclear weapon had been extended to more than a year. In short, the JCPOA was working. And that's not just our view. That's the judgment of international inspectors, independent international inspectors, as well as the State Department at the time. After the last administration withdrew and embarked on its so-called maximum pressure campaign, Iran stopped complying with many of the agreement's critical constraints and expanded and accelerated its enrichment activities. So much so that by now, the breakout time has been shortened to just a few weeks. And the regime significantly ramped up its destabilizing actions in the region, putting our people and our partners at greater risk. Since President Biden took office, we focused on rebuilding a united approach with our allies and partners, putting us in a much stronger position to exert coordinated, effective pressure on Iran. Together, we engaged in a meaningful diplomatic process to see if we could reach agreement for a mutual return to the JCPOA. But Iran has repeatedly demonstrated that it is unwilling or unable to commit to the steps that it needs to take. We continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, but should the Iranian regime reject that path, its leaders should make no mistake that all options are on the table to ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. We will continue to consult closely with European allies, with Israel, with partners in the region, and colleagues in Congress on the way forward. Now, one of the most effective ways to bolster Israel's security is to deepen diplomatic relations with more of its neighbors and with countries around the world. That's why we've worked relentlessly to advance and expand the Abraham Accords and other normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states. Back in March, I joined my counterparts from Morocco, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt for the historic Negev Summit, convened by then Foreign Minister Lapid, something that would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. Early next year, working groups will meet to expand collaboration on key issues in the areas that we've set out for cooperation under Negev, including health, food security, tourism, regional security. The months that we spent mediating talks between Israel and Lebanon led to a historic agreement in October to establish a permanent maritime boundary between the two countries. This will enable the peaceful development of significant energy reserves, and that will be to the benefit of people in both countries, and indeed, people around the globe. This is another demonstration that diplomacy can deliver results, even on what seem to be intractable challenges, even in the Middle East. In July, I joined President Biden on the first direct flight by a U.S. leader from Israel to Saudi Arabia as part of the kingdom's decision to open its airspace to civilian planes to and from Israel. These efforts to integrate Israel are also creating new opportunities beyond the region. In July, the leaders of India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States convened virtually for the first summit of a group that we call I2U2, focused on marshaling the strengths of our governments, our private sectors, civil societies, to solve fundamental challenges facing our people, starting with the twin food security and energy crises that we're living through. Integrating Israel also means continuing to fight for Israel to be treated the same way as every other nation. No more, no less. While we fully respect the right of all to freedom of expression and actively defend and promote this around the world, we continue to reject the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement for unfairly singling out Israel. At the United Nations, we have consistently and vigorously pushed back against unjust anti-Israel bias, reflected in enduring efforts to delegitimize and exclude Israel, and the disproportionate attention Israel continues to receive in places like the Security Council and the Human Rights Council. This unfair treatment not only distracts the UN from focusing on other challenges, but deprives Israel the chance to participate in bodies where it could make valuable contributions to improving the lives of people around the world. we're also fighting against anti-Semitism, which is once again on the rise around the world, including here in the United States. History teaches us how seemingly small acts of intolerance and dehumanization can quickly spread in scale and in scope, especially if no one calls them out. We're not only denouncing anti-Semitism whenever we see it, but we're standing with Jewish communities wherever they're victims of such hatred and working to build broad coalitions across government as well as across civil society to join together in beating back the scourge. Now, for all of its benefits, normalization between Israel and its neighbors is not a substitute for building peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But Israel's growing integration and the broad-based opportunities it creates, this is something that we can leverage to improve the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And not only by the United States, but also by the Arab states that open relations with Israel. As these states work to build and deepen their relationships with Israel, they can also offer support for Palestinians and Israelis to enjoy equal measures of freedom, security, opportunity, justice, and dignity, and for progress toward realizing the enduring goal of two states, which President Biden remains committed to. Now, let me take a minute to share why we continue to strive for this goal. Simply put, it aligns with our deepest values: democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, equality, the idea that all people, regardless of who they are, should have the opportunity to reach their full potential. We believe Palestinians and Israelis, like people everywhere, are entitled to the same rights and the same opportunities. We also support this vision because it's pragmatic. We continue to believe, as the President said on his trip to the Holy Land this summer, that two states, based on the 1967 lines, with mutually agreed swaps, remains the best way to achieve our goal of Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. And of course, it's vital to preserving Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. The United States continues to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. As the President also said in his visit, Jerusalem is central to the national visions of both Palestinians and Israelis and must be a city for all of its people. Anything that takes us away from two states is detrimental to Israel's long-term security and its long-term identity. We know that at this moment, the prospects of a two-state solution feel remote, and that may be an understatement to some. But we are committed to preserving a horizon of hope. That means holding firm to the values that have anchored the friendship between the United States and Israel across countless transitions in government in both of our countries. Israel recently held free and fair elections with robust participation, and a new government is expected to take office in the coming days. We fully respect the democratic choice of the Israeli people. We again congratulate Bibi Netanyahu. We welcome his commitment to make this a government that, in his words, will work for the benefit of all residents of the State of Israel without exception. As President Biden told Mr. Netanyahu when he called to congratulate him, we expect the new Israeli government to continue to work with us to advance our shared values, just as we have previous governments. We'll continue to express our support for core democratic principles, including respect for the rights of the LGBT community and the equal administration of justice for all citizens of Israel. We will gauge the government by the policies it pursues rather than individual personalities. We will hold it to the mutual standards we've established in our relationship over the past 7 decades. And we will speak honestly and respectfully with our Israeli friends, as partners always should. Preserving a horizon of hope also requires that we work relentlessly to prevent any parties from taking actions that could raise tensions or further raise tensions and push the two-state solution even further out of reach. We will always condemn acts of terrorism or violence targeting civilians. There can be no justification for it, ever. And anyone who engages in it must be held accountable. As President Biden has often said, we'll also condemn those who fail to condemn such attacks, or even worse, who praise or reward terrorists or their families. We're deeply concerned that this year has seen dramatically higher levels of violence in the West Bank, perpetrated by both Palestinians and Israeli settlers. This violence must stop. Its perpetrators must face equal justice under the law. We will also continue to unequivocally oppose any acts that undermine the prospects of a two-state solution, including but not limited to settlement expansion, moves towards annexation of the West Bank, disruption to the historic status quo at holy sites, demolitions and evictions, and incitement to violence. Now, I know that many people are disillusioned, many people are frustrated. We've been trying to get to a two-state solution for decades, and yet it seems that we've only gotten further away from that goal. But we cannot afford to give up hope. We cannot succumb to cynicism. We cannot give in to apathy. It's precisely when times are difficult, when peace seems even further from reach, that we simply got to work harder, that we must continue to pursue whatever openings we can to show that progress is still possible. That's why simply discouraging sides from taking steps that undermine the prospects of two states is insufficient. Because the reality is that today, Palestinians and Israelis do not enjoy equal measures of freedom, security, or opportunity. So, we must work not only to preserve the horizon of hope, but to broaden it. We have to go beyond talking about how an eventual peace will improve people's lives and actually show how bringing the two sides closer together can deliver for Palestinians and Israelis in tangible ways. So here's how we're working on that. When President Biden came into office, we re-engaged with the Palestinian people, including resuming aid, and we worked to rebuild trust. Since that time, we provided more than $890 million in assistance for Palestinians, focusing on the issues that have the greatest impact on their daily lives: food, vaccines, support to strengthen Palestinian security. We're working with Congress to provide $100 million to bolster health care for Palestinians through the East Jerusalem Hospital Network. I had an opportunity to visit one of those hospitals on a recent trip. We're finding innovative ways to spur greater, more inclusive economic growth in the West Bank and Gaza, like supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs, expanding access to 4G, increasing the supply of renewable and reliable energy, improving freedom of movement for Palestinian people and Palestinian goods. Making progress on these issues, making progress can materially improve the lives of people right away, and can allow Palestinian youth to at least imagine a brighter future. We're engaging more with civil society, which is a critical pillar of any democracy. Whenever I visit the region, I make a point of meeting with Palestinian and Israeli civil society leaders to be able to hear firsthand from them about the remarkable work that they're doing to address the problems that people face, their challenges and frustrations, and how the United States can do more to support their efforts. We've encouraged the Israeli government to make policy reforms that improve the lives of Palestinians in material ways. A number of them have actually been implemented, including legalizing the status of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank, issuing thousands of work permits for Palestinians in Gaza, increasing Gaza's water supply by 40%. We're also investing more resources in trying to build trust, confidence, understanding between the two sides at the grassroots level. Thanks to bipartisan support from Congress, the Nita Lowey Middle East Partnership for Peace Act will allocate up to $250 million over the next 5 years. These funds will be used to support local projects that bring together Israeli and Palestinian teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs, climate scientists, and leaders from countless other fields to tackle the shared challenges affecting their communities. Building from the bottom up, as well as the middle out, can also be a powerful way to advance progress. Now, the scale may be local, but the lasting bonds that these individuals form will help diffuse tensions before they erupt and build further progress toward peace, again, from the bottom up. If we're to make lasting progress, the Palestinian Authority must carry out meaningful reforms, as the frustrations of the Palestinian people are also driven by a lack of governance and corruption. Strengthening Palestinian institutions, strengthening the rule of law, transparency, accountability, that too is crucial to improving the lives of Palestinians today, also indispensable for laying the foundation for a stable, democratic Palestinian state tomorrow. And just as we believe Israel has a responsibility to take steps to advance the prospects for enduring peace, the Palestinian Authority must demonstrate that it has the will and it has the capacity to be a true partner in a process that can lead to two states. We've made clear our view that unilateral actions at the United Nations will do nothing to address the urgent needs of the Palestinian people or bring the two sides any closer to peace. Just last week, I established the new post of Special Representative for Palestinian Affairs to strengthen our engagement with the Palestinian people. And I've asked someone well known to pretty much everyone here, Hadi Amr, to serve in that role. Hadi is here today. I hope you appreciate the applause. As all of you who work with him know, his knowledge, his experience, his relationships, his principles will make him an ideal leader for this role. Speaking in Bethlehem earlier this year, President Biden said, and I quote, "The best way to feed the flame of hope is to demonstrate that things can be better." To me, it is heartening to look out at all of you, to see so many people, particularly the younger people among you, who still believe in this vision of peace. And not only who believe in it, but who are willing to do the hard work to try to make it a reality. Now, I'm told that there are more than 400 rising leaders from the J Street U that are here at this conference. You're representing some 80 colleges and universities from across the United States. Your commitment to preserving the values that define the partnership between our two nations for decades, that's continuing to feed the flame of hope. That's what gives me confidence that these values will endure, no matter how profoundly they're tested. And no, we will stand with you in this righteous effort. But to each and every one of you, my thanks again for everything that you're doing, again, not just on this day, but every day, to help realize a vision of progress, of possibility throughout the Middle East, for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Again, when times are challenging, this is when we rise to the moment. I'm grateful that J Street continues to do that, continues to make a difference. It's more needed than ever. Thank you so very much. Thank you.